Shabbat Shalom. Starting a series this week. Exploring whether or not we are doing all the things that the early disciples did. And if we're not, what do we do about that? If we are, what do we do about that? I guess it's goes all the ways. But are we living the way? Sometimes we want to get back to basics. We want to go, can we remove these different things, maybe some of the weird doctrines and stuff like that, and just get back to the way it was in the first century, when everything was kumbaya, and everybody was getting along, and it was all peaceable, and they all knew what they were talking about, and they got it. Can we get back to that? Now, this morning we're going to explore part of that with going back in history a little bit, because I think if we're really want to have a deep relationship with God, we want to really be passionate about it and learn more about God, learn more about the walk, do better at walking with God. When I was a kid, I got passionate about automotive things because I grew up in the Detroit area. My dad worked for Ford Tractor at the headquarters of Ford Tractor and service engineer. And so he'd bring me home these broken tractor parts, speedometer that kind of worked, engine oil thing that kind of worked but didn't quite. There's, instead of a speedometer, tractors to keep track of hours of engine life. He'd bring home those sorts of things. Carburetor was great because you could take that apart like crazy and put it back together, which served me well back when I had a junkier car. And could you have those open? But I got interested. I liked engines, and so in middle school, which was junior high for me, 8th or 9th grade, I can't remember. There was a class that was available on taking apart lawnmower engines and putting them back together. That was just totally cool. I loved it. My mom hated it because when I got home, as I'm getting done with the course, I attacked our lawnmower engine at home. And Mom was like having a fit about it, but I was just so passionate about it. It was so easy to do once you learned how to do it. My dad was like, who cares? This is great. My son's actually doing a manly thing. So it was fantastic. But when I got older, I could pull apart a car engine, not be afraid of pulling it apart, mostly be able to put it back together the way it was supposed to be put together. Just as a rabbit trail, I remember I used to take apart the carburetor of my old Ford Torino. The car ran horribly, so I would take it apart every Friday evening and spray it down with carburetor cleaner and then put it back together. And I remember a couple of nights when I got it mostly back together, and then you have the extra part, and it's kind of dangerous to put it back on the car without the whole thing working correctly. But anyway, because I was passionate about it, I really got into it. I wanted to have a deeper knowledge about it. And so if you're passionate about God and having a deeper relationship with God, doesn't it make sense to dig into it a little bit more and find out, what is this all about? And you might say, well, I love the Bible. I love the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament. Oh, I love the Hebrew Bible, and I want to live in the fullness of faith in Yeshua, but how do I do that? How do I wrap my mind around how they were doing it in the first century? For some believers, going to church once a week, praying once in a while, Bible reading once in a while is kind of okay. All of that takes up a lot of time, though. Maybe I should spend more time in Bible study, just to get closer to God. But then if it takes up too much time, we do like our freedom, and so we tend to pull back from that. I want my time. You may notice something as you go follow along through Genesis, Exodus, and now Leviticus. You may notice the same thing in the Brit Hadashah, that living for God seemed to be so central to people's lives that it just seemed ordinary in the scriptures. As you read through the Gospels, it just seems like people were going on in their everyday lives. And part of that is because it was just so ingrained. It was just part of life to live it for God. And you may think that, hey, wouldn't it be great to go back to that? That's the utopia. Everybody getting along and everybody feeling at one with God. But was it really like that? To find out, we need to know something about the first century, and we need to know something about the lives of the Jewish people back then. And if I expect to go back perhaps to the 40s and 50s AD, when there were not so many Gentiles in the faith and it didn't get so messed up at that point, I just want that pure Jewish type feel to it. What was that like? And then we go forward to between 50 AD and 90 AD to figure out what it was like with an increasing number of Gentiles coming in. And how did the Roman government then start to interfere with the Jewish people, first of all, and then that mix of Jewish people and Gentiles as this sect of Judaism grew. And this sect of Judaism was called the Way. And we don't look at those things and figure them out, then if we're looking at some sort of utopian feel of what our religious experience or our experience with God should be, then we're just grasping. We have this view of what it was like back then, but do we? And then we wind up going, if all the other believers around me today would just get with the game, get with the program, get back to the way it used to was. And then we have to ask ourselves, after we peer into the past, what can we incorporate from the past into today? And one thing that I see over and over again is that we get hung up on certain points that blur out or block the big picture of what's going on as far as our relationship with God. We get hung up on, we've been told that the major commandments, though, let me back up a little bit. We have little commandments, and people get hung up on the little commandments, but what are the two big commandments that everything else hangs on? And that's to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, your strength, and then love your neighbor as yourself. And upon these two, all the other commandments hang. I look at it as like a for sale sign on a piece of property. They have the sign up, and then maybe something dangling underneath it. And I think that's what all the other commandments are they're hanging underneath. You take away that top piece that they're hanging on, then you lose it all. And so the bottom line is to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So how do you do that? You have to permeate yourself with a relationship with God and make it integral to everything that you do. We have to get that right. And we have to get it right without leaning too far to the right or to the left. We can't go to extremes. As we talked about in the 9 o'clock hour, that's difficult to do because we have a human tendency of going to one extreme or the other instead of just traveling down the middle. And we need to give people space while we're at the same time knowing that we're developing our relationship with God. Other people are developing their relationship with God at a different pace than ours. So we have to give people space in order to operate in that. And that's okay that we develop at different rates. We move along at different rates. We came into the faith at different places in our lives. Some people are brand new believers. Some have been around for a while. And we've got to give that room. We're all striving, or we all need to be striving to grow closer to God and helping others along that journey. There's no drill sergeant allowed here where you're yelling at people, calling them maggots because they're not doing exactly what you think they ought to be doing. There is a time and place, well, not to call people maggots, but there is a time and place to call somebody out if they're really, really off base. For example, what I want to look at today is kind of starting off this this series by looking at ancient beliefs and ancient systems, what people were thinking about. And a lot of Christians believe that Jewish people, their thoughts, their beliefs back then and even today are monolithic. Everybody believed the same thing. Everybody behaved the same way. Everybody thought the same way. Certainly within Christianity, we tend to think that everybody ought to be believing the same thing instead of having all the different denominations and stuff. But we tend to think, that everybody agreed on everything back then. But I want to start our journey with the Apostle Paul, or Shaul, and his trial in Acts chapter 26. And then we'll go back about 200 years before that. But I thought Acts chapter 26 would be a good launching point because at this point, we're about 30 years or so, maybe 35 years past the resurrection. And so the sect called the Way, has been around for 30, 35 years. And so you pretty much think that everybody's on the same page. And it says, then Paul stretched out his hand and began his defense. I would have loved to hear Paul. He must have been great. Concerning all I am accused of by the Judean leaders, I consider myself fortunate, King Agrippa, that it is before you that I am about to make my defense today, since you are especially knowledgeable about all Jewish customs and issues. Therefore, I beg you to listen patiently to me. Now, all the Jewish people have known my manner of life ever since my youth, starting from the beginning in my own nation and also in Jerusalem. They have known about me for a long time, if they are willing to testify that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived as a Pharisee. Yet now I stand here, being judged for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. It is the promise of our 12 tribes that our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly worship day and night. For this hope I am accused by Jewish people, O king. And right at the beginning, Shaul appeals to King Agrippa's knowledge of that he's knowledgeable about all Jewish customs and issues. And so here at 30, 35 years after the resurrection of Yeshua, the way must have been permeated with Jewish customs and traditions. And those hadn't faded away yet. That would be coming into the 2nd century, 3rd century AD. So if Paul's faith practice is on trial, primarily the resurrection of the dead, that's really what he was accused of, was preaching the resurrection of the dead. What do the Jewish customs and issues have to do with that? What does it matter that Paul lived or lives as a Pharisee? If this is an entirely new religion, those things would not have mattered, but it does matter because the sect is a sect of Judaism at this time. And that's shocking to some people, that the way is a sect of Judaism. I thought a whole brand new thing started on Pentecost, but that's not what happened. It has morphed beyond that into something similar today, similar to Judaism, but very, very different. Early on, as especially Gentile believers came in, they particularly wanted to separate from Judaism. There's a whole raft of issues that are going on there. There's Roman government issues that are playing into this as well. Very dynamic situation that we're not going to get into yet this morning. For this week, though, we're going to take a look at Judaism between 200 BC and 200 AD. And I want to look at some things that may have changed since then. Most of the change has been the impact of Western culture, the Western mindset, or philosophy, which we'll also get into in the next couple of weeks. We talked about that a little bit already this morning with what was the blood. The blood was a cleansing agent. It wasn't icky and disgusting, but it was the cleansing agent, and people understood that the blood contains life, and so you're atoning the sin or cleansing things to make it holy, to be in the holy presence of God with life, with the life that God gives, and cleansing it with that in the blood. Anyway, the Maccabean revolt was back 165 BC or so, was not only to restore the temple, the Maccabeans were also a group of Jewish people standing up against Greek influence. The people were being pulled away into the Greek culture. And so this was really pushback against that. And it was assimilation is what it is. As we get to the end of the first century AD, we wind up, because of the Maccabean revolt and the regrouping of Jewish sects, we find ourselves with four distinct groups of Jews. And there are more than that within Judaism, but four distinct ones that we find taking or operating at that time. They're the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead. They also built fences around the Mosaic law to limit violations of it. It wasn't to change it, but it was to limit violations. The fewer violations, the less you have to make certain type of offerings or having to go through cleansing rituals and stuff like that. And that's really what they were trying to do. They weren't trying to really mess things up, but they were getting nitpicky about things. They were rabbis that people could relate to, unlike the Sadducees. The Sadducees were, I hate to say egomaniacs, but they were kind of egomaniacs. Plus, they had a strong relationship with the Roman government. There was a lot of bribery going on. The government would get kickbacks from the temple and those sorts of things. The high priest, who is supposed to be appointed by God, is appointed by the Roman government. And the Sadducees very, very much tied to the Roman government. They were corrupt, and the people didn't relate to the Sadducees very well. There were the Essenes, who sought to be separated from the influence of the world and also separated from the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They didn't think that those two groups had things quite right, and so they lived almost in a communal type setting, off by themselves. But they did seek to be ceremonially clean at all times. And so the Essenes, one of the things that they were known for was doing a mikveh, going into the water, 5-6 times a day. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees looked at that and going, man, you're really overdoing that. So they weren't seeing eye to eye either. And then there were the Zealots. And you might remember Simon, the Zealot, was one of Yeshua's disciples. The Zealots wanted to overthrow the Roman government at any cost. So they were also murderers and assassins, which I don't find room for in Torah. I don't know if you do. But they thought that they were doing the right thing, the correct thing. But they were out rabble-rousing, wanting to overthrow the government, and infighting with other Jewish sects. And that led to the fall of Jerusalem, destruction of the temple, and all of that. And then there were other groups. So by 30 A.D., there were even smaller sects of Jewish people. If you want to call them denominations, you can, but there were different groups. And there were a whole bunch of them. And they had different practices. They had different ways of looking at Torah. There were some things that were central. Temple was pretty much central for all of them. But they were looking at things different ways. Rabbi Dr. Daniel Boyarin, who's a professor at, I think, University of California, he points out that it seems like the Pharisees of Galilee were pushing back against the Pharisees of Jerusalem, who they thought were taking the extras a little too far, the hand washing and all that bit. So the Pharisees of Galilee were pitted up against the Pharisees of Jerusalem, saying, no, quit adding on to stuff that's just making it too difficult. Does that sound familiar at all from the Gospels? Yeshua's from Galilee. And the discussions that we read about between Yeshua and the Pharisees and the Sadducees really are in-house or family discussions about the proper way to think about the Hebrew Scriptures and the application of Torah. This is what those discussions are. It's not like they're having a fight, but there's one party saying, hey, you're missing the boat on this, and the other party is saying, no, you're missing the boat on this. Who wanted to silence Yeshua and Shaul and the other disciples? It was really the Sadducees, all over the whole idea of the resurrection of the dead. And then after Shavuot or Pentecost, Gamaliel, a Pharisee, was much more lenient towards this new sect of Judaism, the followers of Yeshua. In Acts chapter 5, verse 34, it says that Gamaliel, a teacher of Torah, respected by all people, said to them, men of Israel, he's talking to all the Jewish people there, be careful what you are about to do to these men. And then he goes, some time ago, Theudius rose up, claiming to be somebody. He was followed by 400, and then that fell apart. After that, a fellow named Judah, the Galilean, rose up in the days of the census, and he got a few people to follow him. And so Gamaliel's antidote for all of this is he says, so now I tell you, stay away from these men, leave them alone, for if this is the plan or undertaking of men, it will come to an end. But if it's from God, you will not be able to stop them. You might even be found fighting against God. The point being, in ancient Judaism, it wasn't monolithic. There were all these different ideas out there. I don't know how many different ideas. We don't know. But it certainly wasn't monolithic. And so one group would have one way of doing things. Some other group will have a variation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Except for all the activities prescribed by the Torah about the temple, with the sacrifices, the offerings. Those pretty much everybody did, but on a day-to-day level, things would be different. That's the diversity that we know about. And later on, there was even more. But before 200 BC, we don't know exactly about, we don't know a lot about Jewish practice. In our heads, we can make up things. And go, oh, they were so pious, they were doing this or that. And we don't know. The prophets, though, were calling Jewish people to return to God, to return to Torah, not to assimilate. So we can assume that some of that was going on. So what point do I have in that I'm trying to grasp and pull out of all of this? And where I'm going with this is that if we're searching for the perfect interpretation on how we're supposed to live out our lives as believers, we're going to be searching in vain if we do not first love God with all of our heart, mind, and soul, and we don't love our neighbors as ourselves. On the first subject of loving God, God needs to be so central to everything that we do that it just is. My waking moment is giving thanks to God for that. Whatever I eat, I thank God for it, and I know what I'm eating. When I put on my shoes, I thank God for that. When I see somebody in need, I think, oh, what am I supposed to be doing for that person? And a relationship has been damaged by words or something that you did. What does God say that I should do in order to repair that? And these things, with practice over time, just becomes part of life, part of the routine. And I think that's where in Deuteronomy it says it's not so hard to do these things if you get into the routine of doing it. And you don't have to sit there and go, oh, what should I be doing? It just comes naturally. We give thanks in all things. We acknowledge that He is in control of all things. As we saw this morning earlier, the life is in the blood, which means that God controls all life. And we should be aware of that, which means every living creature is God's. Even the person that you don't like, that person belongs to God. I think that the more we know about the Bible, the more we can draw people to the Bible and away from sidebar issues as far as our faith, things that mess up our walk with God, arguments that we have about, well, do you do communion once a week, twice a week? No, well, twice a week. Once a month, once a year, what do you do? To me, it's a sidebar issue. All Scripture says is do this as often as you do this in remembrance of me. So for some people, it may be every meal. Some people, it may be once a year at Passover or something like that. But should we get into big arguments about those things? No, I don't think so, because we have different ways of approaching it. I know that Yeshua told the woman at the well in John 4 that the day is going to come when we will worship in spirit and truth, and I look forward to that day, because right now we've got these earthly things standing in between true worship with God and worshiping him in spirit and truth. It seems to be that God and God's teachings of the Torah were heavily infused in the hearts and minds of Jewish people in ancient times. I think we know that from what we read in Scripture and history. Life revolved around God and the Torah, around the rhythm of life. That's why we have these rhythms found in Scriptures, where we have Shabbat, we have the new moon, we have God's appointed days, we have birth, we have death, life cycle events, marriage, we have monthly cycles that women go through. These are all things that tie us to God and thinking about God and knowing that God is in all of these things. Western culture seems to want to disassociate God and faith from day-to-day life. But in the ancient Hebraic world, life was just infused with it. Every waking moment ideally lived intentionally. And it wasn't that hard. It wasn't thought of as a religion. Judaism never claimed to be a religion until the 1800s when Reformed Judaism came around. It was just a way of life. And that's my encouragement for us, is that our walk with God just becomes a way of life for us. Not that it becomes boring, not that it becomes so mundane we're not thinking about it, but so that we are just living for God all the time. I love Deuteronomy chapter 30 in verses 15 and 16. You know, Moses in Deuteronomy is going through all these last-minute instructions and repeating stuff, and it's his swan song before he dies, and then the people go into the promised land, and you have had all of these laws or the rules, the teachings, and then it closes out. I almost want to say, well, you could have started off with this instead of burying it at the end. So, see, I have set before you today life and good, and death and evil. What I am commanding you today is to love Adonai your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his mitzvot, his commandments, his statutes, his ordinances. Then you will live and multiply, and Adonai your God will bless you in the land that you're going to possess. And we see in Deuteronomy, at the end of Deuteronomy, that to obey God is life, and to not obey God leads to death. And it's choose life. He says, choose life. This was said to the children of Israel before going into the promised land, but I think that it works for us too. When we choose to pay attention to and actually do what God teaches us, we're going to be choosing life. And as Yeshua said, we'll be choosing life more abundantly through him. And the abundant life doesn't mean that you're going to have riches. Maybe, maybe not. The abundant life is that you're going to be at so much peace with your relationship with God and with the world around you, with people around you, because you're living for God intentionally, and it just is naturally. And you don't have to think about it. Paul's letter to the Ephesians seeks to push people towards unity. Jewish believers and Gentile believers united in the body of believers. Unity as opposed to uniformity. And there's an increasing amount of evidence that Judaism of the early and middle part of the first century was not uniform, but there was unity in it. Imagine you're in the body of believers. You're Jewish and a Pharisee-leaning Jewish person. And now you're worshiping with Zealots who are believers. You're worshiping with Sadducees who became believers. You're worshiping with other people who aren't quite on board with you, but you are one in Yeshua. And then they're not all from Jerusalem. They're not all from that immediate area in Acts chapter 2 at Shavuot. We have people, that Jewish men who have come up, Parthians and Medes, Elamites, those living in Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya towards Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jewish people and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs, a whole diverse population, and they're going to be carrying in some of their culture. And then by 70 AD, a whole bunch of Gentiles who were not proselytes came in. They didn't know much of anything about Judaism. And then they become incorporated into the body of believers. So in the first century, we had believers who were extremely knowledgeable, with a lifetime of knowledge and understanding of God through the scriptures from birth. Others may have been worshiping Zeus yesterday. And we have letters from written to the Corinthians and to the Galatians, to the Ephesians. I just imagine Pastor Paul trying to get all these people in line and working with all of them as you read those letters. So how do you find unity amongst diversity? Probably with humility. We must humble ourselves before God, and we must humble ourselves before each other. What should we be doing in our faith practice? That I'll talk about next week. You thought I'd get to it today, but I'm not getting to it today. But we need to be humble towards each other. We're not all at the same point on our spiritual walk. We have come into the faith with different ideas, different thoughts, different backgrounds. I'm not sure that we will ever find ourselves totally agreeing with each other on faith practice. There are certain things that we have to agree on. The only way to eternal life is through Yeshua. To love God with all our hearts and minds, to love each other. There's some other ones. But there are other things that we're going to differ on, and we have to be okay with that. We have to be humble. The good news is that if you follow the Bible, you study the Bible, it's super easy to do that. When you know what the scriptures say and you learn how to listen to the Holy Spirit. Baruch Hashem.